Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
Today's topic is CMT in context. Where does consumer monetary theory fit in with how other people think about money's role in the economy? We have Austin Mackell joining us to discuss. Austin is the host of the Fair Go Australia Basic Income Discussion Group, and I recommend that everybody check that out on YouTube. He recently published a story on Medium entitled The Monetary Political Compass, where he creates a map of different categories of thought with respect to the nature of money and the desirability of basic income. Welcome, Austin. I'd love for you to start by giving us an overview of why you wrote the article and where you see CMT fitting in.
Hey, well, look, should I pull up the actual compass while I'm discussing this? Just because that could actually be helpful.
Yeah, let's go for it. I'll make it so you can share your screen.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I just want to say that I like the idea of doing an article like this and creating a kind of map for people to understand where all the different thinkers fit into it. I mean, for people that aren't familiar with these debates and don't know the people's positions, that's a really useful project to have a simple summary that kind of positions people and compares them to other thinkers in that space. So I really like this article.
Yeah, so I mean, you can imagine where this starts, where this started for me, and I imagine where some other people are at is like, well, you've learned either about basic income or MMT. These are the sort of most popular sort of starting points to come into this intersection, right? And a lot of people, like I'd heard about, I was fairly familiar with Steve Keen, who's sort of another adjacent thinker, in my opinion. And I learned a bit more about basic income and about MMT from various contexts. And to me, that just obviously went together. And then I discovered that, wait a minute, all the MMTers hate basic income. All the people on the Reddit on MMT were attacking the basic income as this terrible neoliberal idea. And that sort of led to me to try and isolate the variables. You know, who's pro-UBI and who has this sort of post-Keynesian soft money theory. And you know, because for me, what's really interesting is this bottom right corner here where Alex, you can see Alex. And, you know, I was just thinking there's, there's people like Eddie, who you guys interviewed last week, who could definitely be here. A friend of mine, Michael Haynes, he would also fit. I mean, would you put Perry Merling in this bottom right corner as well? Or is that
I would not, no.
Okay.
No.
Could you map him on this?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm not even sure. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so he defies this easy categorization?
Yeah, I mean, I think he stays really in his lane in terms of explaining how money works. So he provides a framework, like a toolkit for understanding money and banking, and that can be used by anyone, anywhere on this compass.
Okay, all right.
Which is hard to do, you know, and he goes through some effort to not, even when he's talking about instances of his model that, you know, we might think would be inconsistent with certain positions. He'll be like, well, this is what the medalists believe, and this is what the chartalists believe. And he doesn't really want to go into that. He doesn't want to make it political. And I think that's to his credit. And I think maybe the only difference between maybe Alex stepping in is that I guess Alex feels that maybe he has to advocate for basic income or a particular policy. He's come to that conclusion anyway. So that's the main difference between, that's why Alex ends up on your compass and someone like Perry Merling would not.
And Alex, as you're the only person on this compass apart from me who's actually listed, who's actually present, do you think are you in the right quadrant? Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, I'm certainly on the pro-UBI side and not the anti-UBI side. I agree with that. I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't use the hard money, soft money distinction. That's not really language that I use. And when I think about money, I don't think about there being kind of fundamentally two different kinds of money. Like I don't think of hard money and soft money as different kinds of things. I think of there being, you have a market economy that needs a standard of value and it's going to choose whatever's most convenient, whatever's most useful as a standard of value, or something that at least is good enough that it can be used. Yeah.
I'm not describing here two different, kinds of currency, right? Like where people are advocating, a stable value or a fluctuating value or anything like that. What I'm saying is there's the way I would put the distinction is some people say that balancing the budget, that the hardest version of this, the Brittany Hunter right up in the top left here, right? In that discourse, balancing the budget, the government spending being equal to tax receipts over the medium term is presented as a technical necessity. You have to do that, or you're going to be in trouble. You're going to go broke the way a household would go broke. The so-called household fallacy, right? That's kind of the dividing line here. So I would say, because I mean, you often said, well, economists all know that that's not the case, but it's really weird when you hear that disconnect between the debate that you hear on TV or in the newspapers and the sort of the way people who have done more academic reading present that. So I mean,
okay, that makes sense then. Yeah, I think you put me in the proper place on the compass. I certainly don't believe that government spending has to match tax receipts exactly. And I'd be a little hesitant to make a claim about what all economists believe, but certainly I think most, especially macroeconomists, understand that governments typically run deficits. It's a very common thing, and they don't end up running matching surpluses to offset them later on. Like, that's not something that you see happening. So at least empirically, I think most economists understand that that this is not a real thing. The balanced budget is not a real thing. Some of them might be concerned that moving too far away from balanced budgets is going to cause a problem, but I think about it differently.
Yeah, so you can see here I put public policy practice actually in the soft money category. So there's this disconnect, as I'm trying to show here, between public policy discourse and public policy practice, which is that governments, as you say, on average run deficits, right? Like running a deficit is the normal thing to do, and it's not it's not catastrophic, right?
Yeah, everybody says they want to balance the budget, and nobody ever does.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that the people down here in the right, especially I would say Jeff Crocker and you and Eddie also very much sort of give a nice tidy answer to a certain extent about, so what is the limit? How do we know when we're spending too much? And that where does the value, the way Jeff Crocker puts it is the value of money comes from the output of the economy. The stuff you can buy with it gives the money the value, right? And so that gives us something to actually shoot for, actually gives us a reasonable target. Like, we're trying to match spending in the economy to productive capacity. Whereas, and that's something that it could be an alternative public discourse, right? Where versus balancing the budget is like, are we spending too much? Are we going to outstrip the economy's productive capacity? And I think when you ask that, people think about it differently. They're like, well, maybe not, because I think people have a general sense that we could be doing more and that the economy could be firing harder and faster, right? So I guess that's the essence of the thinking here, right? How do you get MMT with a UBI, but actually then all of all the puzzle pieces around that you can sort of track through these different thinkers.
Yeah, it's tough to get MMT with a UBI because I think MMT, in terms of their fundamental understanding of what money is that it's tied to taxes and it's tied to labor. So for MMT, taxes drive the currency, and the purpose of taxes is to provision labor and maybe other resources for the government.
So, I don't think a lot of people know that, though, right? So I had a university professor on recently, I think talking about basic income, and he was saying, we can afford this with tax cuts or tax changes or whatever, right? Like closing some tax loopholes. We don't even have to use MMT, though I'm sympathetic to that, right? And another friend of mine wrote a piece that was circulated a bit here in Australia, which was, could MMT fund a UBI, right? Like, so. There's a large who hear the MMT story in brief, which is the government can't run out of money like a stadium can't run out of score points, like points for the scoreboard, right? They hear that and they find that basically convincing, and then they say, well, therefore we could fund a UBI. And I think like there's a lot of people who don't have that deep sort of theoretical understanding of MMT, but do sort of like what it's saying superficially, and they're definitely gettable.
Yeah, well, it's funny, Austin, you say this. I mean, because I actually had a very similar experience to you. I first heard about MMT in this sort of similar superficial way. And my natural inclination is like, well, that seems like it would work well with basic income. But then I went to the meetings and I went to the lectures and I heard Stephanie Kelton speak, and I went to talk to their advocates, and I read the material, and they really they have this very specific theory that they're working with. And if you buy that theory, it follows that basic income is a bad idea. And I do think in the general public, well, before we get to that, I would just want to say, agree with you that in the general public, I think it's true that the word MMT has become a way of referring to deficit spending in general, and the idea that well, maybe we could do more of it. But by that definition, right, we've always been doing MMT. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and so I do think that it just shows that there's. It's interesting how when you see these conflicts over policy, it does usually point to these deeper problems under the hood, and it does suggest to me, having looked under the hood, that the question is not how do we merge MMT and UBI? The question is how do we find a theory of money that is compatible with basic income? Because MMT has a lot written about it, and it clearly isn't.
Yeah, sure. I mean, but this is like, this is why I love the label consumer monetary theory, because it sounds like it's squared that circle for me. And basically, I'm on board, right? Like I think you guys have basically got it right. There's a few points of difference, but even within those points of difference, some of them I think are basically definitional. We're arguing about what the definition of something is, not the substance of what's actually going on. And then there's just a couple of places where we might make different predictions about exactly how it's going to play out. For example, I think me and Alex have very different ideas about how wages would be affected by a basic income. I actually had I came armed with one question that I wanted to ask, because I mean, like, Alex and Derek, you're basically sort of like the Batman and Robin of CMT, right? But I thought I'd try and see if I can like prize any differences out and see, like, especially Derek, is there anything you really think Alex has got wrong, or that you really disagree with Alex about? Because this would be juicy.
Yeah, I didn't come prepared for that. I'd actually love to have that conversation. Earlier on, there was a lot of things that I had questions about, but I think it turned out to be mostly definitional. And I realized, well, okay, he's using a word in the way I didn't expect it, but in most cases, it turned out it was the way economists were using it, right? I would say if there's a meaningful difference, I'm a lot of what I do is at least based on the assumption that the general public or ordinary people or people like me and you can benefit from figuring this stuff out and talking about money. Alex, I think, is very squarely focused on trying to convince economists, and he's sort of laid a bet on that path, and he's putting a lot of his effort into that direction. Whereas I have this idea that a lot of this stuff really is pretty simple, and it's not that hard to understand, even though you might use different words to refer to it. And I think if we can get more people talking about it, I think that's probably beneficial. That may be helpful to actually getting economists to talk about it, actually getting the important parts of the system to respond to it. So if there is a difference, it might be on that question. But I'm definitely looking as hard as I can for other flashpoints, if you will.
Yeah, cool. Well, I look forward to hearing more about them as they develop. I mean, shall I just shut this down? I think another thing I can say about how my thinking on this is shaped, which might not be the same, is living in Ecuador. So I ended up in Ecuador for a bunch of reasons, and partially because we were interested in what the government was doing with Julian Assange, and we thought that, I was a journalist at the time, we thought that would be a good story to cover. But it's a fascinating place. It's had this, of these sort of pink tide countries. I think it's done sort of, I mean, it's got a lot of issues, but I think it's done quite well in this era of, these leftward leaders came in. And part of that is because of Rafael Correa, the particular president rather, who had, he'd written a PhD in heterodox economics before becoming president, which is not as common as it should be, probably. And for example, he pulled the Reserve Bank, the central bank rather, into a super ministry with like the Treasury and the tax office and the development. Like it was like this super ministry of economic planning and development, right? And it was I think there was quite a functional disrespect for this firewall between monetary and fiscal policy that sort of is prevalent in the West, and that worked quite well, right? In fact, he had more success than and in many ways he was just a very competent leader who managed to avoid some of the traps that other people fell into. But I think that insight was part of even his critics, like people who came. There was a friend of mine who was very, very critical of him, had gone overseas to study in the US and came back in 6 years later. It was like I could not recognize how much more developed the country was. It had highways, it had healthcare, it had like this massive transformation, and that showed me what's possible if you can overcome these artificial constraints that we put on ourselves. And I think that's not part of that, it was low-hanging fruit. It's easy to solve some of the worst problems with just a little bit of spending, right? But it showed me that this stuff can work in the real world as well. And that, so I guess that would be that. And one other thing I would say, where I might be a little bit different, I'll let you guys respond to this, is that I actually see a stronger affinity with Marxism with this stuff. So you take Eddie's way of framing it, the worker consumer paradox, right? This is actually very close to what Marx talks about with crises of accumulation or overaccumulation or something, where every employer wants to minimize his wage bill, right? But then there's the workers can't afford to buy the goods, and capitalism has these recurring crises, right? So the paradox of the worker consumer, as Eddie lays it out for people can see the previous, which is I think quite sort of compatible with your language. That's where like you get this Venn diagram where it overlaps to me with Marxism as well. So those might be some points where there's a little bit of divergence.
Yeah, and I think I think about the paradox of the worker consumer. I like that term. I think about it a little bit differently than Eddie does. So I think of the paradox as emerging when you force consumers to be workers, when you force consumers to have jobs be the source of their income. And the way to solve the paradox of the worker consumer is to not force those roles to line up with each other in the economy anymore. Only to the extent, only turn people into workers to the extent that you need them to work. And I think the way Eddie imagines it is that once you have basic income in place, you still have worker consumers, people he would call worker consumers, and they just they're not going to have this problem as much anymore. You're not going to see this problem as much. Whereas I would say the way to fix the paradox is to break the link between workers and consumers. So I think that's a key difference between me and Eddie.
I'd also like to add, I think it's a worthwhile project for someone maybe to try to reconcile Marx with the new world of basic income that we, in all likelihood, find ourselves getting flung into. I would point out that before Marx, there were socialists who were talking about distributing money and wealth to people and getting rid of unnecessary work. And then Marx came around and wrote a lot of pages that had people thinking in a very, 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 very different direction. So I would just say I don't think that's a project I'm too interested in.
Yeah, and we did have economist Karen Helvig Peterson on a few weeks ago to talk about Marx and money, and she's an expert on Marx. And we asked her questions like, what would Marx think about make work and stuff like that? And she said he just wouldn't have a concept of creating jobs as a way of pushing money to consumers. That doesn't really, he wouldn't have talked about that or thought about that. And that makes sense given the time that he was living in. They were shifting from agriculture to industry, and there were tensions there, but Marx was still kind of using a framework for understanding like feudalism and agriculture relationships and applying that to the industry and factory production, and he was trying to make all that theory work. So he was still kind of living in a time where you could make certain simplifying assumptions that maybe are harder to make in today's world.
Yeah, I like what Derek was saying about socialism being broader than Marx as well, right? Like when I say Marxism, it's because that's where you have this classic sort of focus on the paradox. There's this word of internal contradictions, which is very similar to that the phrasing of paradox with Eddie. And I think, but look, what I guess is my recurring thought as well, though, is that like the differences are smaller than the similarities. Once you in this sort of basic area, right? So I was talking about before I encountered consumer monetary theory, I had toyed with the term radical consumerism, right? And then, you know, with Eddie, he's got the word consumption in the thing as well, you know, the worker consumer paradox, right? And Jeff Crocker talks about, you know, well, he's got this graph where he shows his wages and his consumption, and consumption has overtaken wages. And that's basically, you know, what feels so broken about the economy. It's what's interesting. What he does is what I think a lot of people who advocate a basic income then feel compelled to do is say, and we can't fix it with wages. We just couldn't, because we'd all love to give everyone jobs and have everyone working 9 to 5, you know, 50 weeks a year and or whatever it is, right? But we just can't, because technology's so bad, so sad. We'll just have to have a basic income instead. It's not what you want, but you're going to have to live with it. Everyone, you know, hold your nose and take the free money, right? Because we know you're all too good to just like take free money, right? And that's where I think, you know, that's where I really like, you know, you guys will just come out and like, you know, work is not what work is an input, not an output. Work is something you do, you know, because you want something else for it. If you're doing it for its own sake, it's play. It's you know, it's something else, and that's good. Leisure is good.
I liked what you said, Austin, about involuntary employment as contrasted with involuntary unemployment. When you're talking about modern monetary theory, it kind of highlighted this, like why the emphasis on one and not the other. And how is it really the case empirically in the world that more people are concerned with, you know, let's say you had a basic income, how many people would be concerned with not having the job that they want versus having to work a job? You know, it seems like people could figure out other things to do with their time. So I like that a lot. Going just like sort of just a second back from that point, it seems like one of the things that these different people have in common that you've been listing kind of in that space is that they're recognizing, by not abstracting away from money, that there is this role of demand on production, and that has to do with money getting to people. My sense vaguely, and Alex could speak to this more, is that without that and focusing on money itself, you might assume that whatever demand is possible, you're going to have the supply like happen to meet it. You know, you're not quite realizing that demand could be constrained by actually access to money, and hence we might not be at productive capacity and things like that. So it seems like all these theories you're listing are kind of recognizing that in some form. I don't know if you would agree with that.
That's the two quadrants, right? One is like, I mean, at the most UBI, I think there's always an element of it, of what, you know, Arthur C. Clarke talked about, which is the goal of full unemployment, right? You know, and it's come up in Alex's work and in Jeff's work. You have this idea of there's a machine and you get everything, everyone gets everything from the machine, and they just put vouchers in and it comes out. And, you know, I think Crocker actually thinks more about technology than you do, Alex, a bit. But he sort of also talks about how, you know, we're sort of further along the way than you imagine to actually this machine existing. That we're automating more and more work away. Alex's machine is a bit more metaphorical. You can open it, and inside you might find little workers running around, right? But there's this there's always this, I think, idea of being pro-leisure that's inherently part of UBI, but it's not often. But some people sort of try and say, oh well, you know, like I heard it was called the cheap and dirty way of solving the automation problem by this, I'm trying to remember his name now, British economist, wrote Post-Capitalism. If you Google the book Post-Capitalism, Paul Mason, right? He called it, it's the cheap and dirty. It's like, it's a nasty thing, but, you know, we're just going to have to do it. So, but regarding the involuntary employment versus voluntary employment, what I would think what Alex would say is, well, and this is where what I kind of agree is, like, what do we mean by voluntary or involuntary in a world where you're threatened by, you know, poverty if you're not working, right? Even if you've got like good unemployment payments, there's always this like backstop possibility. It is conditional. You have to jump through certain hoops. We could take it away, right? So, but like, is there any voluntary employment in a world without a UBI? Although then I would say what Alex doesn't necessarily state, that the UBI has to cover living costs to be a universal basic income. So then we have this definitional argument about what does basic mean. But yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, Alex might have more to add about how I've characterized his position though.
Yeah, I think you're right that I talk about technology less than Jeff Crocker does. So Jeff Crocker is really looking at the trends of technological advancement and saying, hey, this is leading us somewhere, and where it's leading us, we're not going to be okay unless we have a basic income. Basic income is kind of going to become the obvious solution or something like that. And of course, what I would say to that is talk to any MMTer and they'll tell you how you can get everyone employed. And you can get everyone employed, but that's kind of a nightmare scenario, right? You're employing people for a reason other than the product of their labor. So I like to say that I do think about technology, but I like to say that technology is calling attention to the fact that the way we get people their money is broken, right? So if you ask Jeff Crocker, would basic income have been a useful thing to do 200 years ago? And I have asked him this, and he doesn't really have an answer because he's not thinking about that. He's thinking about, the last 60 years, empirical data about, consumer spending exceeding wage incomes, right? But that's only a tiny slice of the picture, because the wage incomes are largely boosted by economic policy as well. We don't live in an efficient labor market. So there's private debt that's funding consumer spending. That's not consumer debt, right? It's corporate debt. And you've got all this corporate borrowing that's being incentivized as a way of getting businesses to employ people. So there's a much larger gap than the one that Jeff Crocker empirically sees. And that gap that he sees, it could be closed by something like a job guarantee, right? If you push money to people through jobs, then Jeff Crocker's data no longer tells him what it's telling him, but we're still in a bad situation. So that's really not, I mean, obviously it's evidence that there's something going on, but it's not the whole picture. And I wouldn't hang my hat on just that in order to justify basic income.
Well, I would say you could even do it without giving everyone jobs, right? You could even close the gap between wages and consumption by just paying the people who are currently employed more, or just a section of them more. So you could have a thing where there's one third of the population that's exceptionally well paid, 1/3 that's low paid, and 1/3 without a job, and still, in fact, it would be easier because the people who aren't working aren't producing. So that this idea of having sufficient demand in the economy becomes easier to achieve because there's less being produced anyhow. So
yeah,
if that's our goal, it's a kind of.
That's exactly right. You could do it without getting people jobs, and you could do it without a basic income. You just let a lot of people starve, right? Instead of letting them borrow and funding their consumption that way, you just don't let them consume at all.
You just direct all the consumption to some class of people who have more money, right? Like that. If we define that as the goalposts, we've kind of missed the point. Which I mean, like.
Yeah, and there's so that kind of brings up another gap that Jeff Crocker is not paying attention to as much in his particular data that he's emphasizing, which is the gap between what we're producing now and what we could be producing. So this is the output gap, or the capacity utilization that Eddie likes to talk about, right? So that's an important part of it too that Jeff Crocker doesn't really capture. But basic income can be used to close all of these gaps. It can be used to close the output gap. It can be used to close the gap between well, I guess you wouldn't want to necessarily close the gap between wages and consumer spending, but you can replace a lot of that private borrowing with the basic income, not just the consumer borrowing, but the corporate borrowing as well.
I thought it might be interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go.
I thought it might be interesting to point out that Alex used to think about technology more as something that would inevitably lead to a basic income. And actually, I think experienced a greater sense of urgency around improving understanding of the economics when he realized that actually that's not the case, in the sense, or he would say that we have other ways of kind of doing make work to make it, to sort of paper over the fact that if we were really being efficient, perhaps everyone wouldn't have a job, or more people would be unemployed. And so instead of technology necessitating us, having less employment and realizing that we need a basic income, I think his vision changed to seeing that we could kind of just keep on going with pushing, doing make work in these subtle ways that are hard to spot, and keep people unnecessarily busy and needlessly poor. And so there was nothing, maybe in his view, inevitable then about basic income happening. And I think that really, as I said, added urgency to improving understanding so that we don't keep doing that, and instead do something different like a basic income. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah,
but it used to be that he talked about technology much
I have
more.
some blog posts from 2014 where I sound a lot more like Jeff Crocker sounds today, where I'm really emphasizing automation and robots and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I don't think there's this, and this would be my overarching point as well. I don't think there's that much conflict between those points of view, right? Like, I think there's minor differences, in the broader scale of things, because you've got, mainstream economics, for want of a better, to use the very broad term. Then you've kind of got MMT, which is sort of heterodox from that, and then in a sense, we are sort of the heterodox from the heterodox. I know Jeff Crocker's had he's had some exchanges with MMT economists that he felt were not particularly respectful, and so that they're sort of the way that they're disregarded by the mainstream, or they feel disregarded by the mainstream, they then pass that abuse on to this sort of rump on the rump, which is this tiny little group, which I think has basically got it right, in terms of how this stuff works. And the way I would put it, and I think you might agree with this, is the way I see it, is, people ask this question, why don't we have flying cars? Why aren't we living in the Jetsons land? Because it's 2020. It's like, well, because we didn't start basic incomes early enough, right? Probably we should have, let's just take say we had, when that bill was, the famous one that Scott Santons likes to say was almost a UBI, and which was, the one where there was going to be some UBI in the US, but the Democrats voted against it because it was
the Nixon
too
Family
low.
Assistance Plan.
The Nixon Family Assistance Plan. That had we done that, and that had rolled out into a UBI, and they'd been all over the world, then the economy would have been running closer to capacity for more of the previous, 5 decades or whatever. It would have therefore developed more capacity, and we'd be living in this much more technologically advanced world. I think I'm a bit more convinced of that than most people, I think, because not only do I see the capacity increase side, but I also see the efficiency gains, which is kind of what you talk about as well, the work not done, right? That's what they say in startups, is always maximize the work not done, right? Less is more, nothing is best, right? And what I call the beer can problem. So you create a job for someone in town. They've got to drive on the road. They need a car. They have to, and then you have to build this infrastructure to deal with that. And then the people who have the concrete company need to have an accountant, and blah, blah, blah. So when you create a little bit of make work, you actually create a lot of make work, right? And if we got rid of all of that, the economy would be so much more efficient. So take the flying cars. Maybe we'd have flying cars, but we'd only have, a small fleet of them for each community or whatever, because we don't need to travel so often because we've got VR meetings or whatever it is, right? Like that it goes both ways. You have increased capacity, you have diminished capacity. The way we do things currently, you have diminished capacity and decreased efficiency, because efficiency is bad, right? We need to find more stuff for people to do, right? Like if you do things efficiently, you replace, you eliminate jobs. Right. Yeah. Which is crazy because obviously technology is good and it makes life better. So how do we go? There's got to be a way to manage this. We're obviously tripping ourselves up somehow.
And I think what you're doing with you're trying to create a corner of this compass where you can put thinkers who are basically agreed on this very basic point. And I think that's important. I also think it's a good sign that a lot of people are talking about basic income, even remotely similar to the way that we're talking about it here. I also think it's true though that like someone has to be a little bit curmudgeonly about the definitions and actually try to be careful and try to say, okay, well, ultimately big picture, what's the goal and how do we design the optimal policy? I mean, for example, it's a positive sign, I think, today that people are talking about, Biden's his family assistance plan as a basic income for families, because they're talking about basic income. It's not so positive that they're confusing a basic income for this plan, right? Because they're different. And someone has to eventually come along and say, well, close, but no cigar. We have to keep pushing in this direction. Because if you don't do that, then you'll get this other plan in place, and then we'll still be, you still will have the problem of people who aren't in families not having enough income. So
yeah, sometimes I'm worried that the term basic income will get so diluted and so broadly applied that we'll have to come up with a new term for what we used to call basic income.
One thing,
it'll just
go ahead, Austin.
It'll just happen, and it won't be called that. It'll never be called a basic income, and it'll be achieved through, as like the tax refund credit system or whatever. Like it'll be called some innocuous thing.
The wage supplement, the unconditional wage supplement.
Yeah, like I've heard that Chomsky was talking about the Pentagon and he said that they'll deliberately put stuff through the Pentagon that's just like highways that we're building, but they have to be large enough to carry a nuclear missile and land a jumbo jet on or whatever. So that makes the military. So it goes through the Pentagon, so no one questions it, right? Like sometimes you got to get spending through, you got to call it something it's not. So it's called military spending when it's really infrastructure spending, and politics is messy, right? But it's fine to have clean theory. And it's good to have clean theory.
In a way, that's, I think, actually key to Alex's analysis, because he's pointing out that there's lots of things that are nominally supposed to be sort of good for employment, but then actually what's going on is we're coming up with ways to give people money. We're coming up with ways to fund consumers. There's actually nothing wrong with trying to fund consumers, but the way that we're doing it through these other rhetorical justifications, they add complexity into the picture and they add inefficiencies into the picture. And so to some extent, I do wonder if, like, inevitably, you won't be able to rhetorically justify a proper basic income that way. To some extent, it may actually be true that that kind of policy, a calibrated basic income policy or something like it, would have to be argued for on the basis of consumption and not other things, because it's the only way it makes any sense. We could get closer through other things. We could get wage supplements and we could get unemployment insurance that's wide enough and broad enough that it becomes a little bit like a basic income in the way that maybe the Andrew Yang crowd is talking about basic income, or the subsistence basic income crowd is talking about it, but not, I don't think we could get to a calibrated basic income. And regardless of how well we do on the former in the next few years, eventually someone we'll have to get to this other thing. So I feel a little bit confident on placing a long bet here.
I think what we will probably see for a while, there'll be an overlap period, and this is the best case scenario, right, where there's a theoretically clean justification for it over here that the academics are using. Then there's what the politicians are saying over here, which is, freedom dividend with extra bald eagles or whatever the hell, however you sell it, right? And then in between, there's a bunch of experts who are aware of both conversations and kind of holding the whole thing together, right? And then eventually people go, yeah, it's just a basic income, right? Like, and it becomes, but I mean, we don't even call the unemployment payment, right? It was New Start, now it's Job Seeker. And before that, it was, Fresh Starts or, Job Finder or something. Like, there's all these generic laundry kind of names they come up with for policies to make it to act like they're really unique when there's some generic. They're all the dole, right? Or the 25,000 different payments with different names in different countries, right? That are changing the names every 3 years, even though the amount of money stays the same. Those are all an unemployment payment, but they're not really called that. So I don't think. But the other thing I wanted to say is two other things. One was about consumption. It can't be argued for on terms. Maybe we can argue for it on other terms of it. Consumption is like, if we're being intellectually honest, I don't think there is, like, really consumption has to be the center of what it's about, right? Like, but it's not just about the basic income. We have to reframe economics around consumption, because, like, what's the point of the economy? It is to produce the stuff that we need to eat. Right? It's not to give everybody jobs. But the way the discourse happens is as if the production side is the goal, right? When production is just a means to the end of consumption. So that's, I think, really the key to the thing. What we're talking about complexity, I want to bring in a new complexity, if that's okay. And one that I think is actually difficult for basic income advocates, which is the global situation. So there's a reason to have your own, to have, like, farms that are making food that you could just import. Right? And there's a reason to have local production of vaccines and local production of face masks and local production of explosives and guns and planes and things like that. There's a reason for each country to have those, right? So that complicates this picture where you want to maintain your country's economic capacity. And this is where I think some of the problems made by that we have in the economy of today would actually be made worse if you had a basic income in the first world and not the third world. If you had America and Australia and Europe all have basic incomes, you're going to increase the movement of manufacturing out of. I mean, this might time with what me and Alex disagree with about wages, because as far as I can see it, if you've got if you give people unconditional income, they're going to work less, they're going to demand higher wages because their work's going to be in there's going to be more people going to be trying to hire than there are necessarily. It may be a situation where more people try to hire than are willing to work, where there's the problem is finding workers, not workers finding jobs, right? And in that scenario, I see wages going up, and then that increases the competitive advantage of China, Bangladesh, poor countries, where the people will work for almost nothing because the alternatives are even more horrendous, right? Which of course is actually, you know, perhaps the great injustice of the world right now, is the appalling, you know, conditions in third world countries, which could be addressed and very quickly, I think, with something like a global basic income, right? And I know Alex is for a global basic income, but I'm not sure if you guys, that's actually a concern I have, right? About if we introduce a basic income, then how do you fight this bifurcation of the labor markets?
So technology comes in here as a question for me in response to this question. So I wonder how, it depends on where the technology is, but I wonder how much you would go towards exporting to another country versus automating. And this is something where I just don't have the technical knowledge for each field, but you could imagine that there's sort of pressure against automating, as you sort of mentioned with your Jetson scenario, because of the way that we're doing employment right now and getting people their income that way. But perhaps, you know, we would automate even more. And I think already this is Andrew Yang's argument that really we're losing more jobs, if that's a problem, which we don't think it is. But if we're losing more to automation, he would argue maybe than exporting. So one possible scenario is that you could maintain some of the capacity, you know, at home if you wanted that with automation, as opposed to, you know, exporting that capacity. And I agree with you. There are, you know, sort of two issues, I think, with all of it being in other countries. One is like we don't have perfect cooperation even within a country, but certainly between them. I assume you're thinking of things like that. And so you don't want to be like totally vulnerable to another country. And another being kind of redundancy can be helpful if something goes wrong in one country, you know, et cetera. So I guess just to summarize why I think this is important, those are some of the thoughts. But yeah, I wonder what you think about automation versus exporting.
Well, I quickly, I'd just say I think automation is good and outsourcing is bad, more or less, mm-hmm. right? You know, with caveats on all fronts, right? But what I think we also have to take note of is that we can outsource our automation, right? Which is what we're doing now. Like if you don't, like people are saying, oh, we got to teach kids in Australia or the US to learn to code. It's like, they're going to be competing with someone in India whose cost of living is 1/5. Right? So how are you going to get the wages you need to have? So now it's actually saying, no, don't teach them to code, teach them, you know, maths and logic and these higher level skills, right? And there's what's because that'll be relevant regardless of the particular coding language, right? But the point is that, you know, losing jobs is fine, losing skills is bad, and even with a high tech economy, perhaps even more so in a high tech economy, the skills are going to be really important. Like who has the skills to operate this, you know, to run the machinery, right? Unless you've removed the human completely from the loop, which I'm not sure is even really possible, the way people talk about it. But the way I think about automation in general is I don't think, okay, there's this job and a robot comes in one day and you go from having a job to not having a job. The way it's worked traditionally is, you know, there are 10 farmers and they all have a pickaxe, and then there's 5 farmers and they've got a tractor, you know what I mean? And the mix of machine and man labor changes gradually in every industry over time, right? And there's always still a bit of person in there somewhere, you know? But those people will be incredibly valuable, right? And who are practiced and have active skill sets. So you don't want to be, so every country is going to want to have them, at least to some extent, right? And it's just bad to have this highly divided, unequal world. It creates all kinds of perverse problems. And a global basic income, I think, actually does a lot to address that. Whereas everything else, and to me, it's really important because you've got this trade war mentality, right? Like we need to protect local jobs, and even like let's say everybody else just still wants jobs, right? We're right, and they should just chillax and take the free money and have a good time. But you know, they get bored and they all want to, and they want to do this thing of having a job, this cultural form, right? Let's just accept that's what people want to do, right? If you have you've got this, the people are setting up borders and tariffs and trying to renationalize the economy to protect jobs, and that has creates this drag effect and slows down the global economy. This can actually a global basic income could also sort of improve the bargaining position of first world workers while being expansionary to the global economy. And I don't know of anything else that really does that.
So yeah, I like to say that automation is good and outsourcing is good, that they're both good. But kind of to Bethany's point, you know, businesses are going to do whatever's cheapest, right? So you're going to see a combination of both. And whether you'll see more of one or the other, or maybe you'll be outsourcing to China, who is then automating or something like that, you're going to see all that kind of stuff. And that's fine. But to kind of take a step back and talk about, you know, the global economy and a global basic income, a global basic income is the same as a local basic income or the same as a national basic income, except for a larger global, more complicated economy. So you can certainly understand a global basic income using the same framework that we use to understand a national basic income. There might be a little more complexity involved. Certainly, you know, a dollar goes further in Mexico or India than it does in the United States. So you got to factor those things in. But there's also differences like that within the United States as well. Different cities have different kind of local price levels and that kind of thing. So the real question is, what happens when you have a national basic income? And does that cause problems? Do you end up on net making people worse off, or do you end up making some people worse off, right? You know, either one of those is a concern that you kind of have to think about. And my sense is, well, part of it depends on how you're defining a national basic income. So if you're saying we have closed borders, only our citizens get to receive the basic income, and you can't just come here and get a basic income, then that's one form of national basic income. If you say, okay, we're giving basic income to all of our citizens and anyone can move here and become a citizen, that's another kind of national basic income that's maybe a little bit closer to a global basic income. Of course, it's a global basic income that's being run by a particular country and you actually have to go there. But then you could say, well, maybe, you know, it's costly to have everyone move here, so we'll provide this, our nation will provide basic income to everyone in the world. And then you've kind of got a global basic income through the back door. And you've got a particular set of institutions that's associated with a particular nation that's become the global set of institutions providing the global basic income. And maybe that's not the set of institutions that you wanted managing your global basic income. So that can become an issue too. I think there's all kinds of questions related to all of this. But Austin, you're right that I do support global basic income. And it's kind of the perspective that I'm not going to say I started with it immediately, but it's been there since early on, that we could have a global economy with open trade and a single currency and a worldwide basic income.
Yeah, look, the way I frame it is the nested layers of basic income. So you have like $1 a day or two. I mean, I shouldn't pick a number because I think maybe we could go higher. Maybe it could be $5 or $10 a day actually, quite easily, right? Which would have, you know, or after a phase-in period. But the and then you would have that, and that's enough to live on somewhere in the world, right? And then, you know, as an American, you can move to Ecuador. And, you know, set up in, you know, moving with the campesinos there, and you'll have, there is a livable income that's there as a floor for everybody, right? And then, but I would say then, you know, then there's nothing to stop national or European, you know, like continental, like the European Union or the African Union could do it, having like layers on top of that, even down to, I think you could have local ones, right? But that's just a decision that would be made by each of those governments. Right, that at that level, I tend to think of it more associated, you know, more money and stuff are being a bit more closely tied to government than I think you do. I was just listening to your what was it, functional view of money presentation, and one thing, I mean, you sort of say, well, the government is one way that, you know, is one sort of source of, you know, the stability and legitimacy that can make a market accept the currency and use it in transaction. It's like, yeah, and it's the one that happens 99.99999% of the times. Like most of all the currency units ever spent in the history of mankind, greater than 99.999% of them have been either a government or, you know, like a government issued unit or a token for that government based money, right? So I think that there's a special role for government, and that's why I would say.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna put a percentage on it, but you're right that governments are in a unique position to provide a more functional currency than you can really get anywhere else. If you have institutions that are promising to provide a perfect money or a close to perfect money, and they're actually using their policies to generate that or to ensure that, then you're not going to be able to compete with that unless you're another institution, another powerful government institution or something like that. So in the real world, you're going to end up with fiat money, right? That's kind of where you ultimately land, and you kind of have to land there because nothing can compete with something that's being actively managed for the purpose of being useful as money.
Yeah, look, I'm going to pull up the thing again because we're going to have to wrap up soon, right? And I've zoomed right in here. Why is it so zoomed in anyhow? Okay, this is my piece down here is remittances from nowhere, global basic income, and I guess this is as good a place to wrap up as anyhow, because what I think or to get towards the close, because I have this view of the role of the state and money and basic income, and tied in with democracy, as it's like this is how we as a society decide to do things. So where I'm possibly like right out on my own is that I think not like the two things are tied up for me is like we need a global currency, global basic income, and we need a global state because we need that anyhow. Because otherwise we just, like there's this Nash equilibrium problem of competing nations that will inevitably break down into chaos and destruction and we'll all die. Unless we have, we build the global institutions. I think we need them anyhow. And then, so for me, it's an obvious, and I believe that, there's this special role of the state in money. So for me, my sort of, my utopian vision, if you will, is the world parliament, which for a world government, which issues a world basic income, right? And that I can imagine being quite different because you sort of bring it in on top of the existing system. We've talked before, you could make it exchangeable for SDRs, special drawing rights at the IMF, so that governments value it because they can pay their debts with it. Or you have a tax on governments' militaries, which is charged in this. So I'm a bit closer to the MMT in that I'm proposing this global government that validates a currency with certain like legal techniques, right? And that would then that creates the currency in which you pay the basic income. And that we might want to do it differently. So okay, this basic income doesn't really get played with it by banks as much. It's more of a set amount of this new currency, and we can which sort of powers this new global economy, and maybe we have much less of a financial system at this level. You leave the financial systems at the level of the nation, and they can but not have some anyhow. But like it's to me, it's part of it's the sort of foundational thing of a transition towards a Star Trek economy. And maybe I do and like one thing again based on the functional money thing, I think maybe we could have a society in the future where no one pays for anything, right? If no one is ever running out of money, right? If you get to a stage where everyone is spending much less than they have, and that's much less than the society can produce, right? Like where the scarcity just stops being an issue, maybe you do get to a society one day where people just ask for stuff and produce stuff. And more stuff, so much more stuff is being produced than is needed that there's never any tension about scarcity, and we don't need money. I think, it's fine to have that to keep that possibility open in the distant future.
Yeah, I'm not leaving that open.
It's a lot there.
That was a lot. I had a question or a point from far back that kind of relates to this. So maybe since we're getting towards the end, I'll bring it up. And that has to do with kind of why people end up in different places on your, your 2x2. And so one thing that occurred to me is sort of the more people are trying to actively convince large bodies of people and maybe politicians, I feel like the more it's difficult for them to be kind of both pro-UBI and soft money, in the sense that kind of being anti-UBI and more towards the hard money side is conventional at the moment. And so maybe you agree or disagree, but someone like Andrew Yang, maybe one of the reasons he's not also soft money is like, it's just a very hard position to take politically, right? It's already kind of deviant to take a UBI position. So you're kind of only going to take one deviant position. And modern monetary theory, I think of this as well, because they're trying to be more of a political movement. And, it's very radical for them to be soft money. The way they are more conventional is that they are into labor and work. And that's like also a very conventional view. So they kind of like double down on that. So they have that familiarity for people. So it's not like too far out there. And, people in the bottom right, I don't know as much about Jeff Crocker or Steve Keen. I obviously know Alex, and as you pointed out, like he's trying to first start with key people like intellectuals, economists, or people who are open to ideas, as a like you guys and people in this discussion. But he's not necessarily going into the political realm and trying to run for office or something like that, or be, so although he'd love to be a political advisor, it's like not the first thing that he's going for. And so maybe it requires maybe if you can take a more deviant position on multiple dimensions if you're not trying so actively to convince a bunch of people. I would say Carl Widequist also is, I don't know, maybe his bent is trying to like be more broadly appealing. So I don't know what you think about this. Also, and the last thing I'll say is like the global perspective is kind of like yet one more thing that's like hard for people to wrap their heads around. So, it's like kind of even more in that space of being difficult to maybe run for office on that kind of platform. But yeah.
I think about this a lot, and I've got another blog piece coming out soon, which is going to be called "What Do You Actually Fucking Want?" This is, and basically, I introduced the term the possibility budget, right? Like everyone, and I think it extends quite a long way down. I mean, I think Alex does it honestly when he's like, well, maybe we don't need a global institution. Maybe we don't have to set up this whole new UN. We can basically, I think, have the US government basically do it. Is the idea, right?
Well, then they would be a global institution, right? You still have a global institution. It's just a different way of getting there.
Yeah, which the US takes over the world. I don't know. Anyhow, let's not dig down that mine any further, right? Like, but we have this possibility budget, and it's what that means is like everyone's like trying to elbow each other out of the way and get this little finite amount of political possibility that it supposedly exists in the universe. And it's like, no, none of it exists unless we create it. And every time you sort of concede to orthodoxy, you're limiting, you're decreating, you're sucking possibility out of the air. So it's like this, it's a Nash equilibrium thing where everyone's like, well, it's better for me to just focus on my particular proposal. I want to decrease taxes by 4% in, for incomes between this and this. And if I just focus on that and I say, well, I'm not interested in anything else, everything else is unrealistic, I may in the short term increase the chances of my particular tax bill getting through, right? But what that's done is it's collapsed the general sense of political possibility. What's his name? Ralph Nader was talking about this once a few years ago. It was a really interesting interview because he's like, I pioneered this shit, guys. I was like, don't talk about socialism. Don't talk about, liberalism. Don't talk about any isms or any big picture stuff. Talk about seatbelts, right? And he got, seatbelts and then, like all these other like good cause issues that, that he's been involved in campaigning on. And he goes, but by focusing on those single issues, we sort of lost track of this big picture stuff, right? And like, I think what has to happen is we have to, well, I would suggest that more, left-wing intellectuals should go out and take, peyote in the desert or do something to try and shake themselves out of this sense of, stuckness and impossibility. That doesn't mean that once we all change our minds and like think more optimistically, everything's going to change. What I think will happen is things will get worse and worse and worse because current systems aren't adequate. That will get into, the crisis will get worse and worse. And as the crisis worsens, then the possibilities for change become bigger. But they become big in the negative and the positive way. But what we can do is have big ideas ready for when big ideas are needed.
Yeah, when you're playing the game of trying to shift the favor of the general public in a certain political direction, and you kind of enter into that, then you can get into a lot of frustrating scenarios like this where you're now having to compromise on a number of fronts. But I guess maybe I've found it to be a little bit refreshing and a little bit liberating to take more of the economics perspective or the practical perspective, right? Where you're just really trying to focus on kind of, well, what's optimal for this problem I'm trying to solve, and then you can become the kind of person that lots of those different people might come to get your advice on or get your thoughts about a problem, and you're able to say, okay, these other things might be useful. Maybe it was beneficial to have a global government, maybe not. But I think that I don't think that we're not sort of tying that to basic income because we'd like to, but we don't think it's possible. I think maybe, at least speaking for myself, I'm not, I haven't found the calculation which says that that's going to help people in exactly the way that to the extent that basic income will help people. And so I'm sort of focusing on what I think will give us the most bang for the most buck in the immediate future.
And Perry Marilyn, of course, is the perfect example of this. And it's why he doesn't appear on this compass at all, right? He's like the monetary expert, but he doesn't appear on a monetary political compass because he really stays away from the political side.
He just knows about everyone who's on it, right? And look, there's places for lots of different strategies and lots of different kinds of thinking. But what I think there's not enough, like, I think there's too much specificity and too much, professional technocratic wonkery where like we're the very sensible people who can tell you what's possible. Nobody knows what's possible, right? It's possible that werewolves are real. You know what I'm saying, right? Like possible is this, we have no idea what the future will bring. And people, there's this tendency to I think we need a lot of that professionalism, and we need a lot of the specificity and narrowness, but we also need the broad view. And we should try not to shut each other down when people have big ideas, to make room for our idea, especially.
Well, I certainly agree with you, Austin, that we agree on much more than we disagree on. But I think that's also true between, heterodox economists and orthodox economists, and just people in general. Like most people agree on most things, and where the conflict emerges is in the very tiny amount of stuff that we happen to disagree on. So that's what we end up talking about, right? And the badge or the label of heterodox, being a heterodox thinker or a heterodox economist is not necessarily something to be proud of, right? Like if our ideas become mainstream, then we're not thought of as heterodox anymore. So the fact that someone might label us as heterodox is a sign that we haven't yet succeeded. So my hope is that we won't be heterodox for too much longer.
I'm sorry, I know we're going to wrap up, but I think that this is one of the things that like the progressive movement gets wrong in general is like, I don't think that it's not really possible for the left or progressives to imagine winning and being the good guys, right? Like it's almost like we've got in this trap. There's a lot of historical reasons for that, where if you have power, it's bad, right? And that's in my manifesto, which I think you've read. I said there's this paradox of putting the power with the person who's good. It's like a near paradox. It's an impossible thing. That's the challenge of politics, right? And it seems to some extent like people have kind of given up on that, and so they're not pushing forward this big picture vision, which would include a UBI, world government, blah blah blah, because that would just turn into another dystopia, right? Is the kind of
maybe, but
the impulse.
I would just caution you there, because you don't want to be assuming that a lot of the opposition, the resistance you get is from people who would love to have a basic income or a world government, but they're too cautious to put that forward. A lot of times people don't think, speaking just about basic income, a lot of people are not convinced it's a good idea and are skeptical of it, and they often have good questions about it, and they just don't have the right answers. So that's what I would say about that.
Well, in all cases, I wish they would be more honest about what they actually want. I think that's what's missing from the debate. So that's why I put forward what I actually want, not what I think is possible.
Well, I like that. I like your forthright honesty, Austin. It's always been nice to be challenged by you, because you say what you believe, and it's good to have you as part of the discussion. So definitely everybody check out Austin's Fair Go Australia discussion group. I think they go once a month. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, basically it's been once a month, but then we missed a month because I had surgery. So now we're doing 2 in a month. Okay. We had Ben Spies Butcher from Macquarie University, and we had friend of this podcast, Carl Whitequist, coming up. We're just confirming the date for him in the coming weeks.
Yep. And another opportunity for people to go deeper into CMT is that Derek is starting a weekly YouTube and Discord CMT discussion that's going to be starting this Friday. So I would encourage people to check that out too. Derek, if you want to quickly talk about that.
That's right. Yeah, this Friday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm doing my first off the cuff show. We're going to see how it goes, and you can find it. There should be a link to my YouTube channel in the just Derek Van Gorder in the Boston Basic Income page, but you can also find it on my website, derekvangorder.com.
Yep, there is. So thanks so much for joining us, Austin. It's always fun to have a conversation with you. Next week's topic. So Previously, we've talked about the Venezuela crisis. We've talked about the Weimar Republic hyperinflation. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Zimbabwe hyperinflation. So then we will have had we will have covered all three of the kind of gotcha examples that people bring up when you start talking about issuing money to pay for a basic income. So check that out next week.